She's a woman in first century Palestine, and that fact alone consigns her to the bottom of the social hierarchy. Add to that her health condition, and for all practical purposes, she is untouchable. Unclean, they called it. Practically in the same category as a leper. The system had failed her. Had she been a man, the doctors may have been more intentional in finding a cure, but she was a woman. Not worth their time, really. So they took her money and diagnosed her as incurable. But for some reason, she was unwilling to accept their diagnosis. So she took matters into her own hands. She broke the law, not only by refusing to keep her distance from the crowd, but also by intentionally touching the hem of Jesus' cloak, causing him to also be unclean. It was a risk, but she was willing to accept the consequences. Fortunately for her, it's a happy ending to this morning's story. She is miraculously cured, and Jesus praises her audacity, even calling her daughter. She was an activist of sorts, a woman unwilling to accept things the way they were, a woman unwilling to sit at the back of the bus, so to speak, a woman who overcame her fears and took action on her own behalf. God has an affinity for activists, except the Bible usually calls them prophets. People who recognized injustice when they saw it and spoke out against it. Sometimes reluctantly, as in the case of Moses and Jonah, but for others, like Samuel, it seemed to be almost a part of their DNA. And Jesus, yes, we may be attracted to the tender and mild Jesus who said, I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. But he was also an activist who led a protest march on one side of the city of Jerusalem, which parodied the oppressive Roman parade taking place on the other side of the city. But we sanitized that protest march each Palm Sunday, calling it his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. He was an activist who held a demonstration in the temple, but again, we whitewash his act of resistance by calling it the cleansing of the temple. Jesus acted up because that's what prophets do. Fast forward to the year 1977. In California, Proposition 6, commonly known as the Briggs Initiative, was part of a wave of homophobic ballot measures that swept across the United States. The proposition would have banned lesbian and gay people and supporters of lesbian and gay rights from teaching in public schools. Beginning on September 4th, 1977, one of God's prophets, Reverend Troy Perry, the founder of our denomination, held a 16-day fast on the steps of the federal building in Los Angeles to raise funds to fight the initiative. Like the one in this morning's scripture text, this story has a happy ending. The Briggs Initiative was soundly defeated in 1978, due in large part to grassroots organizing which Troy participated in. Reverend Elder Jim Matulski says he was drawn to MCC because it was an activist church. He recounts that as a teenager at gay protest, he kept running into these MCC people. It was something he loved, he says, because they were people who were in the streets, not in the church building. It's something that's foundational to MCC, with our core value of justice that states, working to talk less and do more, we are committed to resisting the structures that oppress people and standing with those who suffer under the weight of oppressive systems, being guided always by our commitment to global human rights. There was no time when that was truer than in the 1980s and 90s, when the AIDS epidemic swept across the landscape, devastating the gay population. As it was in our scripture text, the system failed us. Gay men, IV drug users, and prostitutes were the primary targets of the virus at that time. But they were at the bottom of the social hierarchy, just like the woman was in our text. They were not worth the effort that it would take to find a cure. And so, taking their cue from her, the AIDS community took matters into its own hands. Reverend Elder Matulski says the healthcare model previously before AIDS activism was this: cancer patients individually would interact with the doctor one by one, but never with each other to impact what healthcare looked like. Because we were like a union, a gay union, we unionized healthcare activism around AIDS, and we had an impact by banding together and challenging how health care was provided. Things changed for the better when AIDS patients began to have a say in their own health care. Reverend Elder Matulski says, here's the principle I think we brought from MCC into the AIDS movement. We learned in gay community organizing a principle that when you take people who are stigmatized and kept separate by the broader culture and you bring them together, you can influence a system that seems uninfluenceable or unchangeable. I'll repeat that because it's important. When you take people who are stigmatized and kept separate by the broader culture and you bring them together, you can influence a system that seems uninfluenceable or unchangeable. The problem is we've stopped believing it. We have grown discouraged and no longer believe that we have the power to impact an oppressive system. We no longer believe that our letters, emails, or visits to elected lawmakers make a difference. We have stopped going to rallies because it feels like an echo chamber. We feel as if we are just preaching to the choir. And we feel overwhelmed by the sheer volume of issues that demand our attention and action. Voting rights, transgender oppression, climate justice, health care, the refugee crisis, racial injustice, the income gap, gun violence, and hunger and food insecurity, just to name a few. And we respond to it all by shutting down. We have our own problems to worry about, our own health, our own bills to pay. Believe me, I understand. I have grown tired and discouraged too. And that's when I need you the most. The Apostle Paul told the Thessalonian church members to encourage one another and build each other up. I need your encouragement, and you need mine. But what if we stopped focusing on the success or failure of our outcome and instead focused on the action? What if we left the outcome in God's hands? And what if we instead simply answered God's call to be the prophetic voice that persistently and insistently calls out injustice? There's a song by Hosier called "Nina Cried Power." And the lyrics say, "It's not the waking, it's the rising. It's not the song, it's the singing." For me, that means it's not whether the lawmaker's opinion is changed by my words. It's whether I am willing to continue to shout those words into the windstorm of injustice. It's not whether the story ends happily or not. It's whether I choose to be a participant in the story or not. In the 1960s and 70s, metropolitan community churches offered a safe space for the LGBT community. It was a place where we came to understand that we are God's children, and it was a place where we found our voice. In the 1980s and 90s, the AIDS epidemic taught us how to use that voice for the greater good, to call out oppressive systems and to call forth justice. We must continue to use our voices and our letters and our emails to speak truth to power. And when we grow discouraged, we can band together, for it's in the coming together that we find the strength to continue the fight, the good fight. And so I close today with the words of the late Representative John Lewis. Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful. Be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. Amen.